World War II, 1942 to 1945. From 1939 to 1942, the Axis powers dominated Europe, North Africa, and Asia. Germany used blitzkrieg tactics to dominate Eastern and Western Europe. England was wounded from German attacks in the Battle of Britain. Hitler broke the Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact and marched into Russia. The German and Italian armies dominated northern Africa, threatened the Suez Canal, and the oil fields in the Middle East. The Japanese dominated Asia, crippled the U.S. Navy after the Pearl Harbor attack, and seized most Western colonies in the Pacific. However, the Allied powers began to turn the tide of the war in 1942 and defeated the Axis powers by 1945. When the USA entered World War II, Stalin wanted the Allies to open a Western front and divide the German army. Instead, Great Britain and USA agreed to fight the Axis powers in North Africa. Stalin was angry. The Allies defeated Germany at the Battle of El Alamein in 1942 and then pushed the Axis powers out of Africa. American and British troops invaded Italy, took Sicily in 1943, and seized Rome in 1944. In 1945, Mussolini was captured and executed by the Italian resistance. Meanwhile, the Soviet army stopped the German attack at Moscow and Leningrad in 1942. The Soviets defeated the German army at the Battle of Stalingrad. The Soviet victory at Stalingrad was a turning point in World War II because the Russians began pushing towards Germany from the east by 1943. In 1943, Joseph Stalin of the USSR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt of the USA, and Winston Churchill of Great Britain met in Tehran to coordinate a plan to defeat Germany. At the Tehran conference, the Big Three agreed to open a second front to divide the German army. By 1944, the Allies decided to open a Western front by invading Nazi-occupied France. Operation Overlord, known as D-Day, in June 1944 was the largest land and sea attack in history. The Normandy invasion was deadly, but the Allied victory created a Western front. And allowed the Allies to push towards Germany from the west. At the same time, the Soviet army pushed from the east. Forced to fight a two-front war, Hitler ordered a massive counterattack at the Battle of the Bulge, but lost. By March 1945, the Allies were fighting in Germany and pushing towards Berlin. In February 1945, the Big Three met at the Yalta Conference to create a plan for Europe after the war was over. Stalin agreed to send troops to help the U.S. invade Japan. They agreed to allow self-determination, such as free elections, in nations freed from Nazi rule. They agreed to occupy Germany after the war. And they agreed to create the United Nations. As the Allies pushed into Germany and Poland, troops discovered and liberated concentration and death camps. In April 1945, the Soviet army captured Berlin. On April 30th, 1945, Hitler committed suicide. And on May 9th, 1945, the German government signed an unconditional surrender to the Allies. The world celebrated victory in Europe. While the war was coming to an end in Europe, the Allies continued to fight the Japanese in the Pacific. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, the USA sent troops to the Pacific Theater. The Pacific War revealed a new kind of fighting by using aircraft carriers. The turning point in the war in the Pacific came at the Battle of Midway. After Midway, the Allies began to regain islands that had been controlled by Japan. Japan did not play by traditional rules in war. Kamikaze pilots flew planes into battleships and aircraft carriers. Japanese soldiers refused to surrender and tortured Allied prisoners of war. The problem for the Allies was the time and troops it would cost to retake the thousands of islands the Japanese controlled in the Pacific. The fight for Guadalcanal took 6 months and cost 25,000 Japanese and 2,000 U.S. lives. The U.S. developed an island-hopping strategy to skip the heavily defended islands and seize islands close to Japan. From 1943 to 1945, the Allies took back the Philippines and were moving in on Japan. In 1945, the Allies won the islands of Iwo Jima and Okinawa. From these islands, the U.S. began firebombing Japanese cities. An aerial view of Tokyo during the bombing. Victims of Tokyo firebombing. Despite losing control of the Pacific and withstanding firebomb attacks, Japan refused to surrender. By May 1945, the war in Europe was over and the U.S. began preparing for a land invasion of Japan. But perhaps a land invasion wasn't necessary. In 1939, Albert Einstein wrote U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt about the potential to build a nuclear weapon. President FDR created a top-secret program called the Manhattan Project. Physicist Enrico Fermi at the University of Chicago developed the nuclear reaction. Nuclear plant in Hanford, Washington developed the plutonium. The bomb was constructed in a secret city in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. In July 1945, the bomb was successfully tested at the Los Alamos, New Mexico during Project Trinity. On April 12, 1945, FDR died, and his Vice President, Harry Truman, had to decide how to end the war in the Pacific. In July 1945, the Big Three met again at the Potsdam Conference to discuss the end of World War II. This time, the Big Three would include Harry Truman. Truman learned the atomic bomb was ready and issued the Potsdam Declaration to Japan: surrender or face destruction. When Japan refused to surrender, Truman ordered the bombing of Hiroshima on August 6, 1945. After 3 days, Japan did not surrender, so a second atomic bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. After the second atomic bomb, Emperor Hirohito agreed to a surrender. World War II was over. World War II was the biggest, most deadly, and most impactful war in world history. Europe was destroyed by the war and lost its place as the epicenter of power in the world. The USA and USSR, or Russia, emerged as superpowers and rivals competing for influence in the world. A United Nations was formed to replace the League of Nations to help promote peace. Colonized nations began to demand independence from Europeans.